It was a late afternoon in late autumn, the kind of chilly day when the sun starts to dip early, leaving the sky a deep blue-gray. My dad had always been friends with retired Army guys, but there was one in particular, Colonel Roy Harper, who we often spent weekends with. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, tough as nails with a dry humor that would catch you off guard. We'd met him years ago, and he had a cabin out in the mountains, far enough from civilization that it felt like stepping into a whole different world when you got there. That weekend, it was just me and my dad visiting the cabin. It was a 2-story log cabin, tucked into the woods near a quiet lake, far from any other houses or roads. It had been years since I'd been up there, but the moment we drove up the old gravel path, memories came flooding back. The smell of pine, the sound of the wind rushing through the trees, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Roy was a bit of a recluse these days, though, since his retirement. He didn't come around as much, so my dad made a point of checking in. We arrived around 4, the sun already making its slow descent behind the mountains. Roy had been up there for a few days already. His old German shepherd, Max, greeted us at the door, barking his usual friendly greeting. Roy was sitting on the porch, staring out over the lake. He looked older than the last time I saw him, his face weathered by time, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't dulled. "Good to see you, kid," Roy said, pulling me into a brief, one-armed hug. "Your old man tell you what we're doing out here?" I shook my head, tossing my bag into the corner of the cabin. The place smelled like pine wood and old books, a mixture of the outdoors and Roy's military history collection. Dad and Roy exchanged pleasantries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the cabin or the way Roy greeted us. It was just this strange, underlying tension that seemed to have settled over everything. That night, as darkness enveloped the cabin and the fire crackled in the fireplace, I noticed it more. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows. Max, who usually settled down after a few minutes, kept pacing around the room. His nails clicked on the wooden floor, and every now and then he'd stop, his ears pricked as if listening for something. I tried to brush it off as the usual weirdness of being out in the middle of nowhere, but there was something in Roy's eyes as he stared into the flames. Every so often, he would glance out the window, squinting into the night as though looking for something or someone. "Quiet night tonight," Dad commented, sipping his whiskey. "Yeah," Roy replied, though his voice sounded distracted. "Too quiet, maybe." We ate dinner in silence, the only sound coming from the crackling fire and Max's occasional whining. Afterward, Roy stood up, his face grim. "I'm gonna take a walk," he said, motioning toward the door. "You two stay here. Just keep an eye on the cabin. Might not be a bad idea to lock up tonight." He grabbed his coat and left without another word, leaving us in the silence of the cabin. I couldn't explain it, but I felt unsettled. I wasn't scared, exactly, but there was a nagging feeling in my gut that wouldn't go away. My dad seemed unfazed, but there was something about Roy's sudden decision to go for a walk that didn't sit right with me. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, trying to make sense of the situation. The lake was barely visible in the fading light, but the trees surrounding the cabin were thick and dense. All I could hear was the wind and Max's restless pacing. It felt like the world outside had gone still, almost too still. A half hour passed, and then another. Dad didn't seem bothered by Roy's absence, but I noticed the worry lines on his face, his hand gripping his glass just a bit too tight. It was around 8:30 when I heard it, the faintest sound at first, barely audible. A rustling outside, far off near the tree line. Max's ears perked up immediately, and he started growling low in his throat. I jumped out of my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad?" I whispered, but he was already on his feet, his face tight with concern. "What's that sound?" Dad didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he listened intently. Then he pulled a small flashlight from his jacket pocket and motioned for me to stay put. "Stay here. Lock the door if you need to," he said, his voice quiet but serious. I wasn't about to argue. I locked the door behind him and moved to the window, holding my breath as I peered into the night. My dad was standing at the edge of the porch now, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. Max was barking wildly, and I could hear him bounding off into the woods, following something. Minutes passed, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of Max's barking growing fainter. That's when I saw it. A figure in the woods moving fast and low to the ground. It was hard to make out, but there was something distinctly human about its shape, and it was heading straight for the cabin. My heart raced as I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I knew it wasn't Roy, he was too far out. This was something else, something wrong. I didn't wait. I grabbed my jacket, moved to the door, and double-checked the lock before slipping out into the cold night air. I needed to find Dad. I made my way around the side of the cabin, my breath visible in the air. When I saw him, Dad, crouched behind a large rock at the edge of the clearing. He motioned for me to stay down. "Stay low," he whispered harshly, his hand on my arm. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the tree line, and I followed his gaze. There were at least 3 figures moving through the woods now. They were wearing dark clothes, and their faces were obscured by hoods or masks. They moved with an unsettling quietness, as though they knew exactly what they were doing. Max was still barking, but it was distant now, far off in the trees. "I don't know who they are, but they're not friendly," Dad muttered, his voice tight. "We need to get inside now." We made our way back to the cabin, creeping along the side, but just as we reached the door, there was a loud crash. Someone had kicked the door open from the other side. My heart skipped a beat as I scrambled to get the door shut, but the intruder was already inside. Dad didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy object from the table, one of Roy's old military rifles, and swung it towards the intruder. What followed was chaos. The sounds of struggling, of grunts and harsh whispers, filled the cabin as we fought to keep them out. I had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but it was clear they were not here for good reasons. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally slammed shut. The strangers, whoever they were, had retreated into the night, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Max returned shortly after, his fur matted with leaves, but he was unhurt. Roy, who had been nowhere to be found during the commotion, showed up at the door just as we were catching our breath. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff. We nodded, still shaken. My dad lowered the rifle and I let out a long breath. "It's over," Dad said. "We're safe now." Roy was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "I'm sorry. This is why I stay out here. Those men were probably after something I used to have access to, but they won't come back tonight." The tension slowly began to dissipate as we all realized the immediate danger had passed. But even as we sat down to catch our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. The world outside had a way of creeping into the places you thought were safe. And as for Roy, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets he was hiding out here in the woods. I had never thought of myself as someone who'd be drawn to the idea of staying in a cabin, especially one tucked away on the edge of a graveyard. But when I saw the listing, something about the quiet, isolated nature of the place piqued my interest. It was a cabin located deep in the woods on the outskirts of a small town called Clearwater Hollow. The year was 1997, and I had just turned 25. I had been feeling worn out by the demands of my job and needed time to unwind. The prospect of disconnecting from the world for a few days sounded perfect. The pictures from the online listing made the cabin look like something straight out of a rustic postcard, simple, sturdy, and peaceful. And the graveyard? Well, it seemed like a quirky bonus, though I didn't think much of it. It was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town to the cabin. The road was mostly dirt and gravel, twisting through dense woods with towering pines that made it feel like I was driving into a different world entirely. As I passed the occasional weathered sign that read, "Clearwater Hollow, next 5 miles," I couldn't help but feel a little thrill. It was the kind of place I had seen in movies, where you could get away from everything and just breathe. When I finally arrived, the cabin was just as I had imagined, only a little older. The wood was dark with age, and there was a sense of quiet mystery in the air. It had an old porch with a rocking chair that looked like it hadn't been used in years, but everything seemed perfectly intact. The first thing that struck me wasn't the view, it was the eerie stillness. The trees were so thick, I felt like the cabin was cut off from the world. And there, just beyond the cabin, was the graveyard. It wasn't a huge cemetery by any means, more of a small, abandoned resting place with crooked stones and old iron gates. It looked like no one had visited in years, with thick vines creeping up the gravestones and moss growing in the cracks. I noticed a few old, weather-beaten plaques with names I couldn't make out from the distance. I tried to ignore it. I mean, it's a graveyard, right? People are buried there, but that's just how things go. The first few hours inside the cabin were blissful. I unpacked, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch, watching the evening sun sink behind the trees. The isolation was peaceful, soothing even. But as night fell, I started to feel an odd unease. There was something about the air here, something heavy and thick. The stillness of the forest amplified the quiet, and with no one else around, every sound felt too loud. Even the wind seemed to sigh, like it was trying to tell me something. I brushed it off. After all, who wouldn't feel a little unsettled in a place like this at night? The cabin had no electricity, only an old wood stove for heat and a few lanterns for light. As the sun disappeared, I found myself fumbling for matches to light one of the lanterns. The dim glow it cast on the wooden walls didn't help with the creeping sense of discomfort. But still, I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was a graveyard, sure, but I had nothing to fear. That's when I heard it. A low, distant thudding sound, like something heavy was being dropped on the ground. I froze. My heart started to beat faster, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. Came again. Thud, thud, like something or someone was pacing back and forth in the graveyard. I stepped closer to the window, peering out into the dark. Nothing. The graveyard was just as still as it had been earlier, with the ancient gravestones standing like silent sentinels in the night. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. It wasn't the sound of something natural. The night dragged on. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would ease my mind. But the unease wouldn't leave me. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up, and the silence outside seemed more oppressive than calming. I pulled the blankets tight around my body and closed my eyes, but every time I almost drifted off, I heard something. A rustle in the trees, a scrape against the side of the cabin. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside. I told myself I was imagining it, but when I opened my eyes, the moonlight filtered through the trees in such a way that it made the graveyard look even more unnerving. The iron gate to the cemetery was barely visible, the twisted shape of the fence standing against the backdrop of dense woods. I saw a shadow move by the gate, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing there. My breath caught in my chest. The shadow seemed to hover for a moment, then vanish into the woods. My heart raced. I felt exposed, vulnerable in that cabin, surrounded by miles of wilderness. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I decided to go into town to get some supplies. I needed to get out of that place for a little while to clear my head. I packed a bag and headed down the dirt road, still shaken by the strange occurrences of the previous night. When I reached the small general store in Clearwater Hollow, I found it empty, except for an elderly man behind the counter. I didn't see anyone else around. I bought some food and drinks, but as I was paying, I couldn't help but ask about the cabin. "You staying at the old Wilder cabin?" the man asked without looking up, his voice raspy. I nodded. "You know the graveyard back there's been abandoned for decades, don't you?" he asked. "Used to belong to the Wilder family. They were some of the first folks to settle here, but..." His voice trailed off, and he glanced up at me with a look that I couldn't quite decipher. I smiled awkwardly, trying to dismiss it. "Yeah, I noticed. Seems like no one's been there in a long time." The man paused, then sighed. "You best be careful around that place, son. Things ain't always what they seem. People don't like to talk about it. But that graveyard's seen its share of strange happenings." I didn't press him for more. The last thing I needed was some wild local legend making me paranoid. When I returned to the cabin, the unease came back full force. It was as if the woods themselves were closing in on me, as if something was watching me. The graveyard was even more ominous in the afternoon light, the stones jagged and crooked, the gate hanging open as if inviting me to step closer. I stayed inside for most of the day, but the sounds continued. The thudding, the scraping, the footsteps. They were louder now, closer, as if someone or something was circling the cabin. Finally, I decided to confront whatever it was. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to the edge of the graveyard, my heart pounding. As I approached the gate, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time, they were right behind me. I spun around, shining the light into the dark. There was nothing there, but the footsteps continued, slow, deliberate. And then I saw it, a figure, tall, gaunt, dressed in dark clothes, its face hidden in the shadows. It stood in the graveyard, staring at me, not moving. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The footsteps followed me, getting closer with every stride. I reached the cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I never stayed another night at that cabin. The next morning, I packed up and left, driving straight through the town and never looking back. When I returned to the city, I did some digging. The Wilder family, I found out, had mysteriously disappeared one night years ago. The graveyard, abandoned, held no clues to what had happened, but the townspeople knew. They knew better than to venture near the old graveyard after dark. I had to leave. The graveyard, the footsteps, and that figure, they weren't just things of my imagination, and I would never go back. The old cabin sat at the edge of a small, secluded forest, deep in the hills of northern Pennsylvania. It wasn't much, just a small, weathered structure made of timber and stone, barely holding onto its past glory. It had belonged to my grandfather, who'd passed away years ago. I never spent much time there, but when I needed to get away from the noise of the city, it called me back. This time, I was hoping to spend a few days in peace with my dog, Milo. Milo, my scruffy mutt, had always been by my side. He was loyal, brave in his own way, and never once faltered when it came to protecting me. So, when I decided to leave behind the chaos of everyday life, he was more than eager to come along. His excitement was contagious, and his tail wagged uncontrollably as we drove the long stretch of winding road toward the cabin. The journey felt long, but the sound of Milo's paws scratching at the seat kept the mood light. We arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was a pale gray, thick clouds hanging overhead, warning of a storm that would soon roll in. I didn't mind. There was something oddly comforting about being isolated during bad weather, the cabin offering its warmth and shelter as the wind howled outside. I parked the truck by the front steps, grabbed a couple of bags, and made my way up the creaky steps. Milo was right behind me, sniffing the air, his nose twitching as he tried to pick up on something. The inside of the cabin was just as I remembered, familiar, worn, and cozy. The wood floor creaked beneath my boots, and the faint smell of pine filled the air. It wasn't much. A small living area with an old couch and a stone fireplace, a kitchen with basic appliances, and 2 bedrooms. The walls were lined with old pictures of family and forgotten memories. I dropped my bags and walked around, letting the nostalgia wash over me. I didn't realize it at the time, but something in the air felt different. It was too still, almost as if the world outside was holding its breath. Milo was already exploring. He darted around the room, sniffing corners and looking out the small windows. I noticed him pause at the front door, his head cocked slightly as he stared at something outside. I thought it was just the wind messing with him, so I didn't think much of it. The storm came on quickly. The wind picked up, and rain began to lash against the windows. I lit a fire in the hearth, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin as the crackling of the flames echoed in the otherwise silent house. Milo curled up by the fire, his fur drying slowly as I poured myself a drink, content to watch the storm rage outside. It wasn't long before the first strange thing happened. I was sitting in the chair by the fire, lost in my thoughts when I heard something tapping against the window. It was faint at first, like the sound of raindrops falling, but then it became more rhythmic, like fingers drumming against the glass. I frowned and stood up, walking to the window. The wind had picked up considerably, and the trees outside were bending under its force, but there was nothing at the window, nothing that should have been making that sound. Milo perked up immediately, his ears twitching as he looked toward the window. His hackles stood on end, and he began to growl softly. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't sit right. I dismissed it as the wind again and sat back down. But the tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. Milo barked once, his eyes locked on the window, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stepped outside onto the porch, shining the beam across the yard. Nothing. Just the wind tossing the branches of the trees, the rain beating against the earth. Milo stayed close to my side, his growls quieting but still present. The silence that followed was unnerving, so I decided to head back inside. That night, as the storm continued to rage, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, double-checked the fire, and tried to calm my nerves. Milo stayed unusually close, curling up beside me in bed, his body tense. It wasn't until well after midnight that I finally drifted off to sleep, the wind howling outside and the occasional creak of the cabin settling around me. The dream came that night. It was more of a nightmare, really. I was walking through the woods, and everything around me was pitch black. The trees loomed over me like dark shadows, their branches reaching out, scraping against the sky. Milo was with me, though he looked different. His fur was matted, and his eyes were clouded, distant. He walked beside me, his tail down, and we kept moving deeper into the woods, the air thick and heavy. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. I turned, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I turned back to Milo, and in that moment he wasn't my dog anymore. His eyes were cold, empty, and he let out a low growl. The footsteps grew louder. I felt a sharp prickling on the back of my neck, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, I was jolted awake. The room was dark, the storm still raging outside, but the air was thick with tension. Milo was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide and alert, his body rigid. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, quick, shallow, coming from somewhere just outside the window. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. There was something out there, something watching. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy flashlight, and moved to the window, my heart pounding. I shined the light outside, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the shadows near the trees, was a figure. It was tall, its face obscured by a hood or some kind of dark cloth. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, watching us. I pulled back from the window, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of me screamed to grab my things and leave, but the storm was too violent, and the road was barely visible through the downpour. The wind howled again, and the figure outside seemed to disappear, vanishing into the trees. Milo growled low, his eyes locked on the spot where the figure had stood. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out the window, my hand gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. Finally, I turned, my breath shallow, and took a step back. The storm had slowed, the wind settling. I stood frozen for a long time, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, I grabbed my keys, opened the door, and stepped outside. The wind had died down enough for me to see clearly. There was no sign of the figure anymore. No footprints in the mud, no broken branches, no evidence that anyone had been out there. I don't know why, but something told me that whatever it wasn't gonna hurt us. It was just watching. I glanced at Milo, and he gave me one last look before his tail wagged, as if to say it was okay. I stayed the rest of the night, but I never felt truly at ease again. The next morning, after the storm had cleared, I packed up and left. I never saw that figure again, and the cabin remained quiet, a place where memories lingered. But that night, I learned something about fear. It doesn't always come with a loud noise or a terrifying figure. Sometimes it's the silence, the waiting, the feeling that something or someone is out there watching, waiting. And I'll never forget that feeling, even as I left the cabin behind. The rain hadn't stopped for days, and the once vibrant autumn leaves now littered the ground in soggy, brown clumps. The cabin I'd rented was tucked away in a forest in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't much, just a small, two-bedroom structure built by some distant relative of the owner, but it had everything I needed for a week of solitude. I decided to get away, leave the city behind, and spend time working on my book, away from the noise of modern life. When I arrived on the first day, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the place was. The kind of quiet that feels deep in your bones, like the earth itself was holding its breath. There were no neighbors for miles, and the nearest town was a good 30-minute drive away. Perfect, or so I thought. The cabin itself had its charm. The wooden walls, dark with age, creaked when the wind passed through the gaps in the window frames. There was a fireplace in the living room, and I made sure to stack a good amount of firewood on the porch. Inside, the furniture was rustic but functional. A few worn chairs around a small table, and an old wooden bookshelf stocked with dog-eared books I didn't plan on reading. The beds were basic, with faded quilts that looked like they had been around for generations. I dropped my bags on the bed, set up my laptop on the table, and made a quick meal. The weather was miserable, but that was part of the allure. Rain drummed against the roof, and the trees outside swayed heavily in the wind. As I finished eating, I found myself staring out the window, my thoughts wandering. This was supposed to be a retreat, a place where I could find peace. But as the night fell, a strange unease began to settle in. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. I had just finished reading a few chapters of my book when I heard it, a low, dragging sound from the outside. I pushed my chair back, and the groaning of the old would seem to echo around me. I stood still for a moment, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, as though someone was moving around the back of the cabin. I walked to the window and peered through the rain-smeared glass. The darkness outside swallowed everything whole. The trees were so thick that I couldn't see beyond a few feet, and yet, I felt like something was out there. I shook it off, blaming my overactive imagination. But the noise continued. It was rhythmic, like footsteps dragging across the wet ground, punctuated by the occasional crunch of leaves. My heart began to race. I knew no one else was supposed to be here. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone drive past since I arrived. Still, I told myself it was probably just an animal, a bear, maybe, or a deer. That was normal in these parts. But then the sound shifted. It wasn't just dragging anymore. It was scraping, something sharp and metal, screeching against the wood of the cabin. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't want to go outside. I was alone, and the thought of walking out there in the rain, in the middle of nowhere, was terrifying. But I also couldn't just sit here, listening to the sounds of something or someone slowly working its way around the house. With a trembling hand, I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and slipped on my jacket. The wind outside howled as I opened the door, and the rain hit me in a cold, stinging barrage. My feet crunched the wet gravel as I moved cautiously to the back of the cabin. The light from my flashlight flickered weakly, barely enough to pierce the darkness. I panned it back and forth across the wet yard, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. There was no one here, no one dragging something across the ground. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake the tension, but that's when I heard it again. The sound, closer now. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, where the trees were denser. I couldn't see anything, but I was sure someone, or something, was out there. I froze. Then, in the low light of my flashlight, I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, obscured by the darkness. My breath caught. It was a person, tall and motionless, as though they were waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry. I turned the flashlight off, hoping the darkness would hide me, but I didn't move. Couldn't. The figure didn't budge either, its silhouette just barely visible in the trees. I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. It didn't matter. I was too scared to think. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, revealing more of itself. It was wearing a thick jacket and pants, but its face was shadowed by the brim of a worn-out hat. For a brief moment, I thought it might be someone who had lost their way or was looking for shelter from the storm. But something about the way it moved, slow and deliberate, made me think otherwise. I stepped back, and the crunch of gravel under my boots seemed to echo in the stillness. The figure halted. Then it turned. I didn't dare breathe. It started walking away. Slow at first, but then faster, as if it was trying to get away from me, not the other way around. My mind raced. What the hell was happening? Was it a neighbor? A stranger? Someone who had been watching me? I didn't want to stick around to find out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I bolted back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I didn't stop to think about what I had just seen. I only thought about being safe. I sank onto the couch, gripping the edge of the coffee table, my breath ragged as I tried to calm myself. For the next few hours, I stayed there, staring at the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps. The rain continued, hammering against the cabin's roof, but eventually, I managed to sleep. When morning finally came, I didn't waste time. I packed up my things quickly, threw them into the car, and drove out of the woods, never once looking back. As I left the driveway and pulled onto the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me the entire time, just out of sight. The rain had stopped, but the unease lingered, heavy and suffocating. I never found out who or what had been outside that night, and I don't want to. The memory of those dragging footsteps, the figure in the trees, is something I'll never forget. I'm just glad I left when I did. Some things are better left unknown. It was 2012, and the sun was setting over the hills of the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, casting long shadows across the dirt road that led up to the cabin. I was 28 at the time, freshly out of a relationship that had left me drained, and needed a break from everything: people, technology, the constant noise of city life. My name is Jake, and after weeks of searching for some kind of quiet, I'd found the perfect spot. A small, isolated cabin owned by a man named Earl, who had advertised it online as a quiet escape in the mountains. The drive had been long, the kind where your GPS gets spotty, and the road turned from paved to dirt long before I reached my destination. I had taken a few wrong turns, but eventually, I found myself in front of the cabin, nestled between trees and hidden from view. It was a basic, one-story wooden cabin, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed: a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a couple of old chairs on the porch. No phone service, no internet, just nature, silence, and peace. Earl wasn't around when I arrived, but I had the keys under a rock by the front door, just as he had promised. I let myself in, unpacked my bags, and opened a bottle of whiskey I had brought with me. The sun sank lower in the sky, painting the world outside in hues of orange and pink, and I settled into the porch chair with the whiskey in hand. It was perfect. No one to bother me, just the soft hum of the forest around me. I felt like I could finally breathe again. As the evening progressed, the temperature dropped, and I found myself alone in the cabin, the flicker of a fire the only light in the room. The silence was almost oppressive, but in a good way. It felt like the kind of quiet I had been craving for months. But then, just as I was getting comfortable, I noticed something strange. A faint rustling sound came from outside. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals I had grown used to, the sound of wind through the trees or the occasional bird. This was deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. I sat up straight, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle I had brought with me for hunting, just in case. I glanced out the window, but the porch light cast too many shadows. I saw nothing, just the dark outline of trees against the night sky. I stood up and walked to the door, peering out into the night, but the sound had stopped. Could have been an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon, or it could have been someone. But I didn't know anyone nearby, and Earl had told me I was completely alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself I was just overthinking it. It was probably just the wind. I decided to go to bed. The bed in the cabin was simple. Nothing special, just a mattress and a few blankets. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard it again. This time it was closer. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the porch. The kind of sound that didn't belong in a forest at night. My heart rate quickened, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound continued. A heavy thud, thud, thud against the wooden porch. I grabbed my flashlight, and as I stepped out of the bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the cabin, which had been locked when I arrived, was now slightly ajar. Not much, just a crack, but enough for me to notice in the dim light. I hadn't heard it open. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow, trying not to make a sound. My eyes darted between the door and the window, waiting for anything to move. I stepped outside and shone my flashlight onto the porch. Nothing. No one was there, but the sound of footsteps continued, now coming from the woods, deep in the trees. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But who would answer out here? I was miles from the nearest town. Should I wait? Maybe someone else was just out there, someone who had lost their way. But the feeling in my gut told me this wasn't a simple mistake. I decided to grab my rifle from inside the cabin. As I did, I noticed a small, dirty footprint in the dust just inside the door, right where the door frame met the floor. It wasn't mine, and it definitely wasn't Earl's. It was too small to be a bear's paw, and the shape of it was all wrong for any animal I knew of in the area. Someone had been inside. My mind raced. Who could it have been? And why were they here? I felt my pulse thumping in my ears as I stood there, rifle in hand, trying to make sense of the situation. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and I was certain I would have noticed anyone walking up the long road to the cabin. There were no other cabins for miles. The sound of footsteps grew louder, now almost directly behind me. My body froze, my senses on high alert. I turned slowly, pointing the rifle in the direction of the noise. But nothing. I shone my flashlight into the trees. Still nothing. The rustling had stopped, leaving only the sound of my breathing and the crackling of the fire inside the cabin. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, a man walking toward me through the trees. His outline was barely visible in the moonlight, but I could make out the shape of a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His movements were slow and deliberate, and there was something unsettling about the way he walked. It didn't feel natural, like he was taking his time, as though he wanted to be seen. My heart skipped a beat. Who was this guy? He wasn't Earl. I was sure of it. "Hey!" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Who are you?" The man didn't respond, didn't even flinch. He just kept walking closer, his steps measured and steady. I took a step back, my grip tightening on the rifle. Every instinct told me to stay calm, to assess the situation. But the tension in the air was thick, and I couldn't help but feel like I was about to be attacked. Finally, the man stopped. He stood at the edge of the porch, looking up at me with his face hidden in shadow. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me, like he was staring right through me. Then, without a word, he turned around and disappeared back into the trees. I don't know what I was thinking at that moment. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe I was just exhausted. But I didn't chase after him. I didn't even try to follow. I just stood there, waiting for something else to happen. But the only thing that came was the sound of silence. The same silence that had haunted me ever since I arrived. The rest of the night was uneventful. No more footsteps, no more strange figures. By the time the sun rose, I was packed up and ready to leave. I didn't feel safe in that cabin anymore, and I wasn't sure I ever would again. As I drove down the dirt road, I passed a small sign I hadn't noticed before, just a few miles away from the cabin. It read, "Campbell's Cabin, no trespassing." That's when it hit me. There was no Earl. And the man I saw in the woods, I have no idea who he was, but I don't think he was just lost. I never went back, but I still don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again. I had never been one for vacations, but when my friend, Kyle, invited me to a small cabin he rented out for the weekend, I figured it'd be a good break from the usual grind. The idea of getting away from the city, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air, sounded peaceful. We were 26, just enough to appreciate nature but still have the energy to enjoy it. Kyle was always the outdoorsy type, hiking, camping, kayaking. Me, I liked the idea of being outside, but I wasn't the one to go out of my way for it. The cabin was located in the mountains, not far from a small town called Pine Hill. It was October, and the air had a crisp bite to it, the kind that felt good on your skin but reminded you that winter wasn't far behind. We drove for hours, the road winding deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the silence heavier. It was almost eerie, but Kyle didn't seem to mind. He kept pointing out random spots where we could hike, fish, and do all sorts of outdoor activities. I kept quiet, mostly keeping my eyes on the road. The cabin itself was far from luxurious, but it had that rustic charm that made it feel like the perfect escape. The wood smelled like pine, and the old stone fireplace had a cozy look to it. Inside, it was simple, with just enough room for 2 people, a small kitchen, and a couch that looked like it had seen better days. We didn't need anything more. There was a small porch that overlooked a thick forest. From here, you could hear nothing but the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. We arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. Kyle wasted no time in setting up the fire pit outside, while I unpacked our bags. I was tired but felt oddly restless. Something about the place made my skin prickle. Maybe it was the isolation, the way the cabin seemed like it had been abandoned for years, or maybe it was just the quiet that enveloped us. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet either. Felt too still, too deep. That night, after a quiet dinner of canned beans and hot dogs, we sat around the fire, chatting about random things. But as the night grew darker, I felt my eyes drawn to the trees that surrounded us. There was something about them, how they seemed to stretch higher than they should, casting long shadows that made everything seem off-kilter. Kyle kept talking about his last hiking trip, but I couldn't focus. I kept hearing noises, like something moving out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, a twig snapping. Just one, but loud enough to make my head snap in the direction of the sound. Kyle noticed me looking. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing. Thought I heard something in the trees." He chuckled, taking another sip of his beer. "Probably just a deer or something. You're too jumpy. The only thing you need to worry about out here is getting lost, not some wild animal." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease, but it didn't go away. After a while, we called it a night. Kyle went straight to bed, and I took a little longer to get comfortable. The bed felt too soft, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, hearing every creak and groan of the cabin. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and then something else. A tapping, soft at first, then louder. It was coming from the window. My heart rate picked up. I sat up, trying to figure out what it could be. The window was thick with condensation, the night air pushing its way through the cracks in the frame. But the tapping didn't stop. I got up slowly, careful not to wake Kyle, and crept to the window. I was too afraid to look outside, but I had to. I pulled the curtain back just a little, enough to see the dark outline of the trees and the pale light of the moon. Nothing. No movement. No animals. Just the dark, silent forest. My breath came in short bursts as I stood there, trying to convince myself that it was just a branch hitting the window. But something about it didn't feel right. Something was out there. I moved back to the bed, my mind racing. I tried to go back to sleep, but the tapping didn't stop. It kept going rhythmically, almost like someone was knocking on the window. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was maddening. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I shook Kyle awake, whispering, "Kyle, do you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over. "It's nothing, man. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The tapping was still there, and now it seemed louder, closer. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me. "I'm going outside," I muttered, barely above a whisper. Kyle didn't respond, probably still half asleep. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cold night air, the sharp sting of the wind biting at my face. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over everything. I walked around the cabin, trying to calm my nerves, but the tapping continued. It wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I made my way around the side, the trees creaking and groaning in the wind. The noise was louder now, more insistent. As I reached the back of the cabin, I froze. There, near the tree line, I saw it. Someone standing in the shadows. My blood ran cold. It was a person, but they weren't moving. They were just standing there, unmoving, staring at the cabin. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then the figure slowly raised its hand and tapped the tree next to it, the same rhythm as before. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I turned around and ran back inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me. Kyle was awake now, sitting up in bed. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice groggy but confused. "There's someone out there," I whispered, breathless. Kyle didn't seem to take me seriously at first, but the look on my face must have convinced him. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and opened the door, but when he stepped outside, he froze. I could see him from the window, his face turning pale. "There's nobody out there," he said, his voice shaky. I stared at him through the window, not sure whether I was relieved or terrified. He came back inside, his face serious now. "You sure you saw someone? Because I don't see anyone. Maybe it was just a trick of the light." I didn't respond. Couldn't. The tapping had stopped. The forest had fallen silent again, like nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there wasn't done yet. The next morning, I convinced Kyle to pack up early and head back to town. We didn't speak much on the drive back, but I could tell he felt uneasy too. He didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but something about the way the night had unfolded left both of us on edge. When we reached Pine Hill, we stopped for coffee at a small diner. The waitress, a woman in her 50s, looked at us curiously when we asked if there had been any strange occurrences near the cabin. "Strange occurrences?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean like people disappearing or hearing noises in the woods?" "No, nothing like that. But folks do say the place is quiet. Too quiet sometimes." I didn't press her for more details, but something in her tone made me feel like we weren't the first ones to have strange experiences in those woods. We left Pine Hill soon after, and I didn't think about the cabin again for a long time. But the tapping, it never really left me. It was a quiet evening in early November when I arrived at the cabin in the heart of the English countryside. The wind howled through the tall pines, and the temperature had dropped sharply since I left the nearest village hours ago. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. My cabin sat at the end of a narrow, winding road, far from anything that resembled civilization. No neighbors, no shops, just miles of untamed forest. I had rented the place for a week to escape the noise of London and focus on my writing. The isolation was exactly what I needed. As I pulled up to the cabin, a heavy mist had settled in. The wooden structure loomed before me, ancient and weather-beaten. Its low roof and crooked windows gave it a somewhat eerie look, but nothing I hadn't expected. This was, after all, a traditional countryside cottage, the type you'd imagine in old ghost stories. But I wasn't here for superstition, just solitude. I unloaded my bags and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, even with the late afternoon light trickling through the small windows. The first thing I noticed was the fireplace, already stocked with logs. It felt like a small gesture of warmth amidst the cold air, though the cabin itself seemed lifeless, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. The place had a musty smell, like old books and mildew, but it wasn't unbearable. A quick glance around told me there were no major surprises. The furnishings were dated but functional. An old armchair in front of the fire, a worn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner of the room. The cabin was small but cozy in a way. I set my bags down and started a fire in the hearth. It crackled to life with the help of a few matches, and I felt the first sense of comfort since my arrival. After a while, the warmth began to seep into my bones, and I found myself relaxing. I ate a simple dinner, took a long shower, and curled up on the armchair with a book. As night fully settled in, the wind outside picked up again, the trees groaning under its force. I couldn't help but feel a little unsettled, though I didn't want to admit it. I figured it was just the isolation getting to me. I was fine, I reassured myself. There was nothing to worry about. But then, around midnight, it happened. I had been reading when I heard something that stopped me cold. A sound coming from outside, just beyond the cabin. Faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. I paused, listening, trying to tell myself it was just the wind. But no, it wasn't the wind. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic. Someone or something was outside. I slowly put down my book and moved toward the window. The mist had thickened, and it was hard to make out anything clearly. The trees outside were barely visible, their outlines faint against the dark sky. I strained my eyes, but I saw nothing. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, staring into the mist. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, a fox or some other creature, clawing at the cabin. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I could feel my heart beating faster, my chest tightening. There was something off about it. Then, just as I turned to step away from the window, I saw it. In the distance, standing between two tall pine trees, a figure. A woman. At least I thought it was a woman. She was draped in what looked like a long, dark coat, her face obscured by the shadow of her hood. She was standing unnaturally still, not moving, just staring directly at the cabin. I froze. My body went cold, my mind racing. Who was she? What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I quickly backed away from the window, my heart now hammering in my chest. I couldn't look at her any longer. The feeling of being watched, of being observed by someone I couldn't even see clearly, was overwhelming. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was going to happen next. I grabbed my phone from the table and dialed the local authorities, though I wasn't sure what I expected them to do. There was no easy way to describe the situation. The dispatcher answered after the third ring. "Hello, what's your emergency?" I explained as calmly as I could that I thought I saw someone outside my cabin. The dispatcher didn't sound particularly concerned, telling me it was probably just a local wandering the area. They advised me to lock up and stay inside. "Wait it out," they said. "If you feel unsafe, let us know." But I wasn't sure if I felt safe anymore. I locked the door and drew the blinds, but the sensation of someone watching me never left. The woman's image lingered in my mind, her stillness unnerving. The feeling that something was terribly wrong hung in the air like a thick fog. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the cabin made my heart skip a beat. I kept imagining that I would hear the scratching sound again, but it never came. The next morning, I tried to put it all behind me. I told myself I had overreacted, that the night's events had just been the product of my imagination running wild. The day was bright, the sun finally breaking through the clouds. I went outside, hoping some fresh air would clear my mind. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud, leading right up to the front door. The prints were fresh, deep, heavy, like someone had been standing right outside. I traced the steps with my eyes, and as I looked toward the trees, I froze. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was the same woman. Only now, she wasn't just standing still. She was walking slowly, deliberately toward the cabin. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. She wasn't wearing a hood anymore. Her face was pale, gaunt, with dark bags under her eyes. Her expression was blank, almost emotionless, as if she were in a trance. The closer she got, the more I could see that her clothes were torn and ragged, as if they had been through years of wear and tear. Her hands, pale and skeletal, hung limply at her sides. I couldn't take my eyes off her as she drew closer. I knew I had to do something, anything, but my body felt like stone. The woman came right up to the door and stood there, staring at me through the window. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I was too scared to do anything, too scared to breathe. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the mist. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally gathered the courage to step outside, the footprints were gone. The mud had returned to its smooth, undisturbed state. I packed my things and left the cabin that day. I don't know who or what that woman was, but I will never forget the feeling of being watched, the feeling that I was not alone. I never went back to that cabin again, and I haven't looked for it since. But every time I think about it, I still feel that chill down my spine, like something or someone was out there waiting for me to return. I had always been a bit of a loner, someone who liked to get away from everything and everyone. So when I found myself with a weekend to kill and nothing to do, I thought a trip to an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods would be the perfect way to escape. I had heard about the cabin from a friend of a friend, someone who said it was an old hunting cabin left to rot after the last of the family had passed away. He told me that it was in the middle of nowhere, a few miles off the nearest trail, and that it was likely to be empty. Perfect for me, quiet, isolated, no distractions. I packed a few supplies, just the essentials: food, water, a flashlight, and a sleeping bag. I didn't bother with any of the fancy gear that most people would take into the wilderness. I wasn't planning on staying more than a day or two, and I figured I could handle it without much trouble. The drive to the location was long, winding, and filled with empty stretches of dirt roads. The further I went, the more I felt the weight of isolation pressing down on me. It wasn't that I was scared, exactly. I'd done solo trips like this before, but there was something about the way the landscape opened up around me. Endless fields of dry grass, trees stripped bare, and the occasional lonely farmhouse that made me uneasy. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the horizon. The cabin wasn't much to look at. It was a small, decaying structure, built in the old style with rough-hewn logs and a sagging roof. The windows were cracked, some entirely shattered, and the front door hung on its hinges like it might fall off with the next gust of wind. I could see through the gaps in the wood that the interior was a mess of old furniture, dust, and cobwebs. It looked like nobody had stepped foot inside for years. I didn't let the state of the place deter me, though. I wasn't exactly picky when it came to shelter. I grabbed my gear, walked up to the door, and shoved it open. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the empty woods. Inside, the air smelled musty and stale, like old wood and mildew. I set down my bag and took a few moments to look around. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, a rickety wooden table in the center, and a single, lumpy armchair shoved up against the wall. The place looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Half-finished meals left on the table, dishes strewn about, papers scattered across the floor. I made myself comfortable as best as I could. I lit a fire in the fireplace and set up my sleeping bag near it. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, and it soon became a welcome companion. As I sat there, I thought about how peaceful this place was. So quiet, so far away from the noise of everyday life. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe without feeling the weight of everything hanging over me. But as the night wore on, things began to feel off. It was hard to pinpoint exactly why, but the atmosphere of the cabin had shifted. Maybe it was the wind howling outside, or the strange creaks and groans coming from the wood as the temperature dropped. The fire was starting to die down, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. It wasn't long before I started hearing noises coming from upstairs. Soft, almost imperceptible sounds at first. Something dragging across the floor, the faintest shuffle of footsteps. I froze, staring up at the staircase that led to the second floor. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. The cabin was old, and the wood settled a lot. Still, the sounds kept coming like something or someone was moving around up there. I grabbed my flashlight and crept cautiously toward the stairs. The light flickered as I shone it around, illuminating the dust and decay that covered the wooden steps. I held my breath as I started to climb, my steps slow and deliberate. The sound grew louder the higher I went, almost like someone was pacing back and forth in the room above. I reached the top of the stairs, my hands trembling as I reached for the door to the room above. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. If it was an animal, I could deal with it. But if it was something else, I didn't know what I would do. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. There was nothing. The room was empty. The moonlight filtering through the broken windows cast eerie shadows across the walls, but the space was otherwise still. I shined my flashlight around, scanning every corner, every nook. Nothing moved. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but at the same time, I felt like a fool for having let my imagination run wild. I returned to the main floor and tried to shake off the strange feeling. It was getting late, so I decided to turn in for the night. But just as I was about to crawl into my sleeping bag, I heard a loud thump from upstairs. My stomach dropped. This time, the sound wasn't subtle. It was a heavy, unmistakable noise that echoed through the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and stood there, frozen, not knowing whether to go up and investigate or stay put. My mind raced through a dozen possibilities. Maybe an animal had gotten into the cabin. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, closer this time, like something or someone was moving around up there. Without thinking, I ran up the stairs. My flashlight beam bounced across the room at the top, landing on a pile of debris, an old mattress, and broken furniture. I scanned every corner, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then something caught my eye. A small, rusted key was sitting on the floor near the bed. It was old, covered in dust and grime. It didn't belong there. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand, wondering what it could be for. There was a faint engraving on the side, but I couldn't make it out. I heard something behind me, a shuffling sound. I spun around, but the room was still empty. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The key felt heavy in my hand, like it was drawing me toward something. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin held secrets. Secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I left the room quickly, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't know if I slept or if I just stayed awake, listening to the silence and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. In the morning, I packed my things quickly, eager to leave the cabin behind. As I stepped outside, the sun was rising, and the world looked different in the light of day. The eerie feeling that had clung to me the night before began to fade, replaced by a sense of relief. I never found out what the key was for. I never went back to that cabin. But I knew one thing for sure. There was something about that place that made me feel like I wasn't meant to be there. Something, or someone had been watching me, waiting for me to leave, and I didn't plan on giving it another chance to make its presence known. It was the last weekend in September when I made the decision to take a trip up to the cabin I'd inherited from my uncle. Located deep in the mountains of western New Mexico, the cabin was nestled on a small piece of land surrounded by thick trees and jagged cliffs. I had spent the past few years telling myself I'd go visit, but life always seemed to get in the way. Work, relationships, the general chaos of daily life. But now, with a long weekend ahead of me and the mountains calling, I figured it was time to finally go. I was 32 at the time, still getting over a rough breakup, and hoping the solitude would give me the peace of mind I needed. I drove alone, no dog, no friends, just me and the road. The drive was long, winding through desert and rock-strewn valleys, until finally, after what felt like hours, I arrived at the cabin. It wasn't much, a small, weathered structure built from logs, the kind of cabin you see in old movies. Its paint was chipped, and the roof sagged slightly, but it had character. The place had been in my family for generations, but no one had lived in it for over a decade. My uncle had been a reclusive man, and after he passed away, I was left with the responsibility of looking after it. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The mountains loomed around me, steep and imposing. I grabbed my backpack from the car, locked it up, and went inside. The cabin smelled musty, like old wood and mildew. The floors creaked under my weight as I stepped in, the air thick with dust. I set my stuff down in the corner and started a fire in the wood stove. The warmth felt good against the chill that had started to settle in with the dusk. I spent the next few hours unpacking, making a cup of coffee, and getting used to the eerie stillness of the place. It wasn't long before night started to fall. As I sat on the couch, the fire flickering in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't that I heard anything or saw anything, but something about the place made my skin crawl. I dismissed it, of course. It was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the surroundings. I decided to take a walk before dark settled fully. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. I grabbed my jacket, strapped a flashlight to my belt, and headed out into the woods behind the cabin. The air was cool, and the ground was soft under my boots. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. I could hear nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. My breath formed small clouds in the cold air. I had been walking for about half an hour when I noticed something odd. The forest seemed unnervingly still. I stopped and listened, straining to hear anything that might break the silence, but there was nothing. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not even the wind rustling the leaves. It was then that I realized I had wandered farther than I intended, and I should probably turn back. As I began retracing my steps, I heard a noise, something to my left. It was faint at first, but then it grew clearer. It was a sound I couldn't quite place, a sort of rustling followed by a low grunt. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. Whatever it was moving through the brush, and it sounded heavy, too heavy to be a deer or a coyote. A chill ran down my spine. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the area around me. The beam of light caught the shape of a figure moving between the trees. I blinked, confused, because I could have sworn it looked like a person, but something was off. The figure moved unnaturally, too fast, too jerky, like it was stumbling yet still maintaining a strange speed. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I called out, but my voice felt small in the vastness of the woods. No response. The figure didn't stop. It kept moving in and out of my line of sight, moving with an unsettling kind of grace, like it was in control of its movements despite its erratic, twitching motions. I took a few steps back, my heart starting to pound. Something told me I shouldn't stay, but before I could turn around, I heard something even worse, a voice. At first, it sounded like the wind, a low, soft murmur, but then it became clearer. "Help me?" The voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. I froze again, my mind racing. The voice sounded human, but it was muffled and distant, like it was coming from inside the trees. My instincts told me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. The figure moved closer, now out in the open, and my heart stopped. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its legs were bent in a way that no person's should be, like they were twisted backward at the joints. Its skin was rough and mottled, like it had been stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes were dark, hollow, but somehow glowing faintly. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something I had only heard about in old tales and rumors. A skinwalker. My body went cold, and my legs felt like they were filled with lead. I backed up slowly, trying not to make a sound, but the figure kept advancing, its head tilting to one side as if it were studying me, sizing me up. My mind raced. The legends my uncle had told me about the skinwalkers came flooding back to me. Shapeshifters, creatures of the night that could mimic the forms of animals and people, drawing power from dark rituals. I didn't wait around to find out if the stories were true. I spun on my heel and ran, hard and fast, through the forest, trying to make my way back to the cabin. I didn't stop to look back. The only sound in my ears was my own breath, harsh and ragged, and the pounding of my heart. I didn't get far. A sharp pain shot through my leg, and I fell to the ground with a crash. My flashlight flew out of my hand, and the world plunged into darkness. I scrambled to get up, but my leg wouldn't move. Something was holding it down, pinning it to the ground. I turned my head and saw the figure again, closer now, its shadow looming over me like a nightmare made flesh. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever would come next. But then, in the distance, I heard a car engine. The sound was faint, but it was enough to get my attention. The figure hesitated for a moment, its head jerking toward the noise. It seemed to consider something before it slowly backed away, retreating into the trees. I didn't wait around to figure out why it had left. I pulled myself to my feet and hobbled toward the sound of the engine, desperate for help. The car came into view, a truck with a couple of guys in the front seat, clearly local. I waved my arms frantically, and they stopped, rushing over to help me. They helped me into the truck and drove me back to town, where I would eventually get treatment for the gash on my leg. They didn't ask many questions, but they gave me a look that told me they knew exactly what had happened. When I was well enough to leave, I drove back to the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I never went back to that cabin. And though I'm not sure if I truly saw a skinwalker or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I can't shake the thought that something lives in those woods, something that watches from the shadows, waiting for its next prey. I left the keys with the guys from the truck. I figured it was better for someone else to deal with it, far away from me. But deep down, I know the woods are still watching, and one day, someone else will hear the whisper on the wind. The first time I stepped into the cabin on the farm, I thought it would be a quiet getaway, a break from the noise, a place to breathe and reset. The old farmhouse was about an hour outside of town, nestled at the edge of a cornfield. It was a cool autumn day, the trees beginning to change colors, and the smell of wet earth in the air. The owner, an older man named Raymond, had warned me the cabin was a bit rustic, but it was cheap, and I didn't mind a little rough living. I was in my late 20s, a freelance writer with more time than money. A weekend in a cabin seemed perfect to finish a project I had been dragging my feet on. The cabin sat at the back of Raymond's farm, a small, isolated spot surrounded by tall cornfields that stretched for miles. It had a small porch with a few mismatched chairs and a weathered door that creaked loudly when you opened it. Inside, the place was dark. Even though the sun was still high in the sky, dust hung thick in the air, and the old wood floors creaked under my feet. There was a fireplace on the far wall with a few chairs set up around it, as if someone had lived there once but had long since moved on. It didn't seem all that bad. Maybe a little neglected, but nothing too strange. I set my bag down and unpacked a few things, settled into one of the chairs by the fire. The air smelled faintly of smoke, and there were strange marks on the walls, almost like scorch marks, but I brushed it off as just the weathered wood, maybe some old smoke stains from years of use. After all, the cabin was old. The only thing that stood out was the door leading into what I assumed was a bedroom. It didn't look right. There was something off about it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the door frame seemed warped, as if it had been forced open at some point. I dismissed it and decided to head outside to explore the farm. The wind picked up in the late afternoon, making the cornfields sway and groan. The farm was dead quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I noticed there were no animals around, no birds, no rabbits hopping through the fields. It felt like the farm was holding its breath. It wasn't until dusk that I began to feel uneasy, that quiet unease creeping up my spine, making the hairs on my neck stand up. I thought it was just the isolation getting to me, so I went back into the cabin, closed the door, and tried to focus on my writing. Night fell quickly, and the small room seemed to close in around me. I tried to sleep but couldn't. The bed was uncomfortable, and I kept hearing the faint sound of scratching, like something was scraping the outside of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or maybe a bird, but it didn't stop. It was a persistent scratching sound, as if something was trying to get inside. I got up and pulled open the curtains, but there was nothing out there. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the cornfields swaying gently in the breeze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin. I wasn't scared, but I was uncomfortable. Maybe the place was just too old for me. As I walked around the yard, I noticed something strange in the dirt near the edge of the cornfield. There was a trail, long and narrow, like something had been dragged through the ground. The trail led into the corn, but there was no sign of what had made it. I went back inside, grabbed my stuff, and threw it into the car. As I was about to leave, I caught sight of something on the porch. A small, strange bundle of twigs and leaves tied together with a piece of string. I bent down to examine it, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It wasn't natural. The bundle was too symmetrical, too intentional. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the twine, a sharp gust of wind blew through the porch, knocking the bundle off the steps. It tumbled down the wooden stairs and into the dirt, rolling away like it had a life of its own. I grabbed my bag and sped out of there, but as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the cabin. When I reached the end of the long dirt road that led to Raymond's farm, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the cabin behind me, but it was gone. There was no cabin, just the open fields and the wind. I drove for hours, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my gut. It wasn't until the next morning that I got the call. Raymond's voice was frantic, like he was out of breath. "Did you leave the cabin?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah, I left yesterday." "Why? Did you see anything strange?" he asked, his voice dropping lower. "Something out of place?" I froze. I hadn't told him anything about the bundle of twigs or the feeling of being watched, but somehow he knew. "I don't know," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. There was something, I don't know, it just didn't feel right. Raymond was silent for a long moment before speaking again. "Listen to me, that farm, it's been in my family for generations. There's something about it. People have gone missing around there, and there are things that don't belong." He stopped as if weighing his next words. "The cabin you stayed in wasn't always a cabin. It was built over something much older. Before my family bought the farm, before we settled here, there were people who used to live here, people who didn't leave willingly." I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't the superstitious type, but the way Raymond spoke made my stomach drop. I didn't know if he was trying to scare me or if he was genuinely worried, but either way, I didn't want to go back. "What do you mean, didn't leave willingly?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know all the details. My grandfather never talked about it much. But there's a story, something about a family that lived there before, and the father, he did something he shouldn't have. And after that, things started happening. People disappearing, things getting moved around. It's all been quiet for a while, but I've seen things, heard things. The cabin you stayed in? It's just the tip of the iceberg." I didn't need to hear anymore. I hung up, my hands shaking. It didn't matter what Raymond said. I wasn't going back. That night, I slept with every light on in my apartment. I tried to push the thoughts of the cabin, the bundle of twigs, and Raymond's cryptic warnings out of my head. But they kept coming back. The unease, the fear that something was out there, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. The next day, I received a text from Raymond. His words short and to the point. "Stay away from the farm. Whatever you do, don't go back. I don't think I ever will." It was the kind of night that felt like the world was on the brink of falling apart. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the small cabin I had built for myself in the woods. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I sought it out. After a few years of living in a bustling city, I wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I could breathe without the constant hum of traffic, the clang of construction, and the noise of too many people. So, I built the cabin from scratch, small, simple, just big enough for me and my few belongings. I had arrived just a few hours earlier, hoping to get settled in before the storm hit. It was late October, and the weather had turned fast. The wind had picked up around dusk, and the rain started shortly after. By now, the storm was in full swing. The roof groaned under the weight of the rain, and the cabin's walls felt damp, the wooden planks absorbing the moisture from the outside air. I lit a fire in the small stone hearth, watching the flames dance as the wind rattled the windows. I wasn't new to the woods. I'd spent a lot of time camping in places like this when I was younger, but this time felt different. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. There was no phone signal out here, and the nearest town was a good hour's drive away. My only company was the constant sound of the storm and the occasional crack of a branch breaking in the distance. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into the old armchair I'd found at a yard sale before I left the city. The flickering firelight made the shadows in the cabin stretch across the walls, and I found myself staring at the dark corners more than I should have. The wind outside whistled through the trees, and every now and then, the storm would swell with a crash of thunder that rattled the windows. I felt at peace for a while, but as the night wore on, something began to feel off. It started with the noise. It wasn't loud, but it was consistent. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me, the wind picking up different sounds as it moved through the trees. But after a while, I started to hear something else, something not quite like the wind. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just outside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. I peered out the window, but the rain and darkness made it impossible to see anything more than a blur of shadows. The sound of footsteps continued, now closer, pacing in a circle around the cabin. My stomach tightened, I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded human, heavy, deliberate, as if someone was carefully walking around the cabin, avoiding the muddy spots but making their presence known. I checked the door. It was locked, as it should be, but something about the way the wind howled outside, combined with the eerie rhythm of the steps, made my skin crawl. The fire flickered, casting odd shapes on the walls. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and made my way to the back door, heart pounding. I was trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or some kind of trick my mind was playing on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps continued, now right at the edge of the cabin, just beyond the window where I stood. The wind had stopped, and the only sound now was the soft padding of those steps. I opened the door slowly, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the rain like a knife, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal, just trees. I stepped outside, holding the flashlight in front of me, my breath coming in short bursts from the cold air. My boots squelched in the mud as I moved around the cabin, checking every corner, every shadow. I found nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. As I turned to head back inside, I heard something, a soft thud from the back of the cabin, followed by a scraping sound. It was coming from behind the structure, where the trees were thick and the wind had no chance of reaching. My mind raced. I knew that I should go inside, lock the door, and forget about it. But curiosity, or maybe foolishness, kept me moving toward the noise. I moved to the back of the cabin, my flashlight flicking over the ground, the rain now drenching me to the bone. The sound had stopped, but there was a dark shape ahead, a figure, hunched over and almost blending in with the shadows of the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure wasn't moving. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, not sure if I should run or approach. Finally, I took a step forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That was when I heard it, a low groan, almost like someone in pain. I froze, the hair on my neck standing up. I didn't know what to do. Was it a person, or was it something else? I stepped closer, heart thudding in my chest. The figure hadn't moved, but the groaning continued. It sounded human, but something wasn't right about it. I stepped forward again, this time within a few feet of the figure. My flashlight hit the ground, and my stomach twisted when I saw what was lying there. It was a man, disheveled, his clothes torn, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide open, but they were glazed over, staring into nothing. He didn't move when I shone the light on him, just lay there in the mud, groaning softly. I backed up, panic flooding through me. I didn't know how long he had been there, or if he was even alive, but something told me that he had been watching the cabin, just as I had felt. The footsteps I'd heard earlier, had he been pacing around the cabin, waiting for something? I hesitated for a moment, then ran inside. I locked the door and grabbed my phone, praying for a signal, but the screen remained empty. I didn't know what to do. If the man needed help, I had no way to reach anyone. If he was dangerous, I had no way of protecting myself. The rain continued to pour down, and the storm seemed to intensify. I couldn't stop thinking about the man outside. Was he just lost? Or was there something more to this? I didn't know. All I knew was that the night wasn't over, and the storm was far from the only thing I had to worry about. In the end, I decided to stay inside the cabin. I moved every piece of furniture I could find to block the door and the windows, hoping that whatever was out there would leave me alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As the night wore on, I could still hear the wind, but the footsteps were gone. The man was gone, I didn't know if I would ever know what happened to him, or if the storm had driven him mad. All I knew was that the silence that followed felt more dangerous than any noise had been. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun was out, and everything looked calm, almost serene. I never saw that man again, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone out there in the woods, and the cabin I'd built for peace had become a place of uncertainty. The steps I'd heard that night, they never stopped echoing in my mind. It had been over a year since the divorce, but when I heard the news that he had passed, something inside me stirred. I didn't feel the relief I had expected. Instead, a strange knot tightened in my stomach, an unsettling feeling I couldn't quite place. It was one of those situations where your brain knows it's over, but your heart refuses to let go. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel, so I pushed those feelings aside. I hadn't been back to his cabin since the divorce. That place, tucked away in the woods outside of town, had been his pride and joy. After the divorce, I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere near it, let alone visit. But now, I was standing in front of it, the sun setting behind me, casting long shadows across the weather-beaten wood. The cabin hadn't changed much, though I could see a few repairs had been made. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I climbed up. It was strange to be here, but at the same time, it felt like the only place where I could truly make sense of things. The air smelled of pine and earth, the kind of scent that had always calmed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though the woods around me were empty. A gust of wind blew through the trees, rattling the leaves, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the cabin was exactly as I remembered it. The old leather couch in front of the fireplace, the wooden table with mismatched chairs, and the kitchen counter covered with a few coffee mugs and plates. Things we used to use every day. The silence inside the cabin was thick, almost oppressive. I walked further in, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. A part of me wanted to leave immediately, but another part needed to be here to make sense of the past, to put closure on a chapter of my life I hadn't fully understood. His things were still scattered around, and I could almost imagine him walking around the cabin, doing the things he used to do. There was a part of me that missed those routines, even if they were mundane. I walked into the bedroom, my fingers grazing the edge of the worn quilt on the bed. His old boots were still by the door, the ones he always wore when he went out hiking in the mountains. The sight of them hit me harder than I expected. I felt the old wounds reopening, the ones I had tried to forget. But then something caught my eye. On the nightstand next to the bed was a photo frame. It wasn't one I recognized. I walked closer and picked it up. It was a picture of him and me, but it was different. It wasn't a memory I had. We were standing on the edge of a cliff, the sun setting behind us. But the strange thing was, neither of us looked particularly happy. Our smiles were forced, and there was a tension in the air that wasn't there when I remembered the trip. I stared at the photo for a while, trying to make sense of it, but it only made my chest tighten. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I hadn't taken that photo. I was sure of it. I placed the frame back and turned toward the window, trying to shake off the unease. The forest outside was still, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows as the light continued to fade. That's when I noticed the door to the basement was slightly ajar. I had forgotten about the basement, about the space beneath the cabin that we had always used for storage. But there had always been something off about that place. I never liked going down there. It was dark and smelled damp, like old wood and mildew. I didn't want to go down there, but curiosity pushed me forward. I walked over to the door and slowly pulled it open. A cool breeze swept out from the stairs, and the air smelled musty, just like I remembered. My hand hesitated over the light switch, but I flipped it on anyway. The bulb flickered to life with a harsh buzz. The stairs led down into the darkness, and I stood there for a long moment, trying to talk myself out of it. But I couldn't. I had to see what was down there. Maybe it was just old boxes, junk that had been left behind. Maybe there was something I could take with me, something that would make all of this make sense. I slowly descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was colder than I had remembered. The walls lined with old wooden beams that seemed to lean inwards as if the space itself was trying to collapse. The light bulb overhead flickered again, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. At the far end of the basement, I saw something strange. A large wooden chest, covered in dust and cobwebs. It wasn't something we'd ever had down here. I hadn't seen it before. A feeling of dread settled over me, thick and heavy, as I walked toward it. My heart was pounding in my chest as I knelt down and slowly lifted the lid. Inside the chest was a collection of old papers, books, and a few trinkets. But what caught my attention was the large, leather-bound journal sitting on top. It didn't belong to me. I opened it, and the handwriting was unmistakable. It was his, but the words didn't make sense. There were pages filled with strange drawings, symbols I didn't recognize, and passages written in a hurried, erratic style. It was like he was trying to tell me something, but it was so jumbled and chaotic that I couldn't make sense of it. But one word kept repeating itself throughout the journal. Watching, I flipped through more pages, my fingers trembling. The further I read, the more I realized how deeply disturbed he had become in the months before our divorce. There were mentions of strange noises around the cabin, of people watching him when he went out into the woods. He had written that he believed someone was following him, that the forest itself was alive and aware of his every move. The last entry in the journal was dated just a few weeks before his death. It was a single, chilling sentence. "I think I'm not alone anymore." The air around me felt heavier, as if the room itself was closing in. I slammed the journal shut, a jolt of panic shooting through me. My eyes darted around the basement, but there was nothing there, no signs of anything unusual. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating. I stumbled back up the stairs, my heart racing. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, but the unease didn't go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been inside that journal had somehow followed me here. I didn't want to stay any longer. The cabin, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cage. A place that held dark memories, a place that seemed to hold secrets far deeper than I had ever realized. I grabbed my coat, walked out the door, and didn't look back. As I stepped away from the cabin, the weight on my chest began to lift. But something told me I wouldn't be able to escape the things I had uncovered. Not completely. And even though I left the cabin behind, the questions lingered. The mystery of what had happened, of what he had experienced before his death, stayed with me. The one thing I knew for sure was that I would never return to that place again. Some things are better left buried in the past. It was the middle of October when I decided to take a solo hunting trip up to a cabin I'd rented out for the weekend. The place was tucked away in the dense woods of northern Wisconsin, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. I'd found the cabin online after some browsing. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in an old horror novel. Isolated, rough around the edges, and surrounded by thick forest that stretched for miles. But I wasn't bothered by the isolation. If anything, it was what I was looking for. A weekend to clear my mind and get away from everything. I'd been hunting since I was young, following my father's footsteps. He was a seasoned hunter, someone who could track a deer for miles without breaking a sweat. I wasn't quite at his level, but I could hold my own. The cabin, with its wood paneling and creaky floors, felt like the perfect base for what would be a quiet, solitary weekend of hunting. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun starting to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the driveway. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bit into your skin when you weren't moving. I unloaded my gear, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my nostrils as I looked around. The cabin was simple, with a large stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen, and a couple of bedrooms upstairs. The kind of place where you'd spend most of your time outside or in front of the fire. The place was secluded, with no other buildings in sight. My only neighbors were the wild animals that roamed the woods. I set up camp inside, checking the gear I'd brought with me: rifle, hunting knife, first aid kit, and the usual survival essentials. There was a small woodpile next to the cabin, which would be more than enough to keep the fire going through the night. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk around the property to familiarize myself with the area. The woods were quiet, far too quiet. There was no wind, and the usual sounds of birds and insects were absent. It wasn't unusual for the forest to go still at times, but this felt different, unsettling almost. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the isolation and the fact that I wasn't used to being this far from civilization. I continued my walk, marking a few spots where I thought I might set up some trail cameras or hunting blinds the next day. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun had set. I built a fire in the hearth, the crackling was the only sound that broke the silence. I ate a quick dinner, just some canned stew and a couple of sandwiches, and then settled in to read a book by the fire. My mind drifted a little, not thinking much of anything. It was a good feeling being away from everything. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a soft thud, like something heavy had hit the ground. I sat up, setting my book aside, and listened. There it was again, a thud followed by a low, dragging sound. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my rifle from the corner, walking quietly to the window and peeking out. The forest outside was bathed in the pale light of the moon, but I couldn't see anything unusual. No movement, no shapes, just the trees and the quiet. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear knocking over some branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stayed by the window, waiting, listening. The dragging sound continued, getting closer, like whatever it was moving through the woods towards the cabin. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft, shuffling step on the porch. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself flat against the wall. The door creaked and then nothing. I stayed still, not moving an inch, trying to hear any more sounds. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, but eventually, I started to feel foolish. Whatever it was had probably gone away, or it was some animal after all. Still, I couldn't bring myself to relax. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was out there. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and quietly opened the door. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I stepped out onto the porch, sweeping the light around. The beam flickered for a moment, and that's when I saw it. A trail of what looked like blood leading from the edge of the trees to the porch steps. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my mind racing. Was it an animal? A deer, maybe, that had been wounded and had dragged itself across the ground? But the blood was too dark, too thick. It didn't look fresh. And then there was the fact that it seemed to be leading up to my cabin. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I was trying to rationalize it, to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was just a deer that had wandered too close, gotten scared, and ran off. But the more I thought about it, the less that made sense. Something felt off. The woods were too still, the silence too unnerving. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, my rifle across my lap, listening to the occasional crack of the cabin settling. But I never heard that dragging sound again. By morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. The light of day had a way of making everything seem less threatening, and I figured I'd just been spooked by the isolation. I went outside and inspected the blood trail. It was real, no doubt about it, but I couldn't find any sign of an animal. No prints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if whatever had left the trail had simply disappeared. I spent the next couple of days hunting, but the events of that first night stayed with me. I kept checking my traps, my cameras, the perimeter of the cabin, but nothing unusual happened. I never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary again, but the unease lingered. The isolation felt heavier now, the silence more oppressive. I didn't sleep well, waking up at every little sound, half expecting something to be standing in the doorway. On the last night of my stay, I was sitting by the fire again, staring into the flames. The woods were still and quiet, but then I heard it again, the dragging sound. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my rifle, ran to the back door, and opened it. I had to know what it was. There was nothing there, nothing but the wind and the shadows. I spent the rest of the night on edge, checking the locks, scanning the woods from every window. But by morning, I packed up and left, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The drive back to civilization felt like a relief, like the weight of the woods had finally lifted. When I returned home, I found an old article online about disappearances in the area. It wasn't much, just a brief mention of hunters and campers who'd gone missing over the years, with no clear explanation. The last entry was from about 20 years ago. I never went back to that cabin, and part of me thinks I never will. It was supposed to be a quiet week, just me and the cabin, surrounded by the thick pines of the Clearwater National Park. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was the kind of place where the only sound you hear at night is the rustling of the trees or the distant call of an owl. I've been working as a park ranger here for 3 years, and I thought I had seen it all. But that week was different. The job had its fair share of solitude, but I was used to it. Most of my duties involved patrolling, checking trails, and keeping an eye on campers. That's why I had volunteered to take a shift alone in the ranger's cabin on the edge of the park. The cabin was small but functional, with a wood stove, a cot in the corner, and a desk cluttered with maps and reports. It was peaceful. Far from civilization, no one bothered you out here. At least that's how it was supposed to be. It all started on the second day. The morning was crisp, the kind of cool you can only get in late fall. I was making coffee when I heard something from outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But then, I heard it again. A sound like scraping, like something was dragging along the ground. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't make that noise. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The woods were silent, too silent. No birds, no wind. I stood there for a minute, squinting into the trees. It was hard to see much in the dim light, but I thought I caught a flicker of movement near the tree line. I called out, but nothing answered. I shrugged it off, convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Later that day, I had to drive out to a remote part of the park to inspect a trail. The road was rough, hardly more than a dirt path in places, and the truck bounced along as I made my way toward the farthest edge of the park. By the time I returned to the cabin, it was nearly dark. As I pulled up, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the cabin, big, heavy prints like someone had been standing right outside. I didn't recognize them. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The park was closed to the public until the spring. My heart started to race, but I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was someone from the Forestry Service or another ranger. I didn't think too much of it at first, but as the evening went on, the unease started to creep in. The air felt colder than it should have been, and I kept hearing things outside. First, it was the sound of footsteps, faint but deliberate. Then, the unmistakable sound of someone tapping against the window. Not a knock, just a light tapping, like someone was trying to get my attention without making a sound. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside again, but the porch was empty.
No footprints.
No signs of anyone. I searched the area around the cabin, but it was just the wind, bending the trees and causing branches to sway. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I locked all the windows and doors and settled into the cot. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The wood stove crackled in the corner, and the warmth from it did little to ease the chill that had taken hold of my chest. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing things. A twig snapping in the distance, the rustling of leaves, the sound of someone moving just outside. Around midnight, I heard something different. A distinct voice, low, almost a whisper, carried in through the thin walls of the cabin. It wasn't clear enough to understand, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my rifle from the corner of the room and moved to the window. The trees were still. The snow-covered ground was undisturbed. But then I saw it, a figure moving at the edge of the forest, just out of the reach of the porch light. It was tall, too tall, with long limbs that didn't move like a human's. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't right. I spent the next few hours in a daze, pacing the cabin, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that the tension started to ease. The figure had disappeared, and the sounds had stopped. I thought it was over. I was wrong. The next morning, I checked the outside of the cabin once again. More footprints. This time, they were deeper, more pronounced. They didn't lead away from the cabin. They circled around it as if whoever or whatever it was had been watching me while I slept. I followed the trail, my breath visible in the cold air, until it led me to the edge of the forest. There, among the trees, was a tree stump, and next to it, carved into the bark, were words. At first, I couldn't make them out. They were scratched into the wood, like someone had dug their fingernails into it. But when I stepped closer, I could see that it said one thing over and over again: don't trust the silence. I didn't know what it meant, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I heard it again, the tapping, soft but persistent. This time, it was coming from inside the cabin. I rushed back, rifle in hand, but when I opened the door, nothing was out of place. No one was there, but as I stepped inside, my foot caught on something. I looked down. It was a piece of paper folded neatly. I opened it, and the message was clear. They're watching you. I didn't stick around to figure out who or what they were. I packed up what little gear I had left, grabbed my emergency radio, and headed out. The drive back to the ranger station felt like an eternity. Every crack in the trees, every shadow felt like it was hiding something. When I finally got back to the station, I reported everything, but no one believed me. They said it was probably just some kids messing around, or maybe a bear. But I knew better. It's been a few months since that night, and I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. I don't work at that cabin anymore. I don't even work in Clearwater Park anymore. I took a job at a different station, somewhere far away from the trees. But every now and then, when the wind picks up just right, I hear the tapping again. And I know, no matter how far I go, I'll never truly escape what happened that night. The silence was never meant to be trusted.